the next several weeks. And what we'll look at this morning is, for example, one of the things I've learned across the years as I've been a minister and even a Christian myself, it seems like it's pretty common, even as we go farther into our history as believers, that very few people really understand the role of the Ten Commandments in the life of a believer. There's such a forgetfulness, seems like, about what kind of role the Ten Commandments play in the life of the believer. Let me first back up quickly and say to you that our salvation is not based upon keeping the law. I'm not going to address it from that aspect, but I am going to say that it is the very best guide to living what we call a holy, righteous life. God set those down so we'd have a right relationship with Him and a right relationship with those people around us. And so that's the point of what I'm looking at this morning. It's extremely important for us to understand that. Even the earliest portions of the book of Genesis, we find, God's recorded some laws. In Exodus chapter 20, for example, we find the first mention of that. And even as far back in those particular days, the Jews called these the 10 words, or 10 statements, the way I would translate. And so in their Torah, that's where we would find it references that, even the book of Deuteronomy. And the Torah is basically the Jewish, well, it's not actually the Jewish Old Testament, but the Jewish first 5 books of what we call our Old Testament, what we call the Pentateuch. So as far back as then, it's addressed as that. Now, these laws were given by the hand of God to Moses on Mount Sinai, while the Israelite nation waited there for Moses to go and speak with God, and God would provide the laws. Now, Moses comes back and tells them what these laws are in a verbal sense, and then he goes back up, and God gives him the rest of what we call, he expands on those laws, and then writes them out in a tablet form. So that's kind of background about that. I would say the Ten Commandments are probably the best known examples of what we call moral law in our Western society. It is the foundation for most law codes, like in Europe and America and any place that came from Europe, that particular part of the country. Became the basis of our law code that we even have today, the original basis for that. And so it has a great undergirding of our society. Now, many people, when I say the Ten Commandments, know what I'm talking about and know what I'm referencing to, but sadly, there's very few people that could probably give you detail what each of those 10 mean. They might name a few, they might name some of them, but very few people seem to be able to give you the details of all 10 of those. And that's a very sad commentary in our society. Even more tragically, sometimes even among Christian believers, some of those people have difficulty naming those laws and giving the details of those particular laws. So, oftentimes when the Ten Commandments are not forgotten, they're often misquoted or misinterpreted, sometimes seen as obsolete and outdated from a grumpy old God who just wants to take away our fun. And it's often seen by that, especially for those outside the church who don't understand the whole concept of the Ten Commandments. But the Ten Commandments is the best thing we have, the best guide we have to live at peace with God and live at peace with one another. Now, again, I remind you, not a relationship through Jesus Christ, but once we know Christ and know our personal relationship to God through that, it is the guide. It's the best way for us to live that right living, or what we call righteous life. So we understand then how to live and how we should live. And so it helps us grow in a righteous living, helps us grow in what we call holiness. It's a guide for how we should direct our lives. And it's not meant to discourage us, but it's meant to give us an understanding of what God expects of us and how to live up to that particular guideline. So we're going to take this morning the first 2 of them. We're going to look at Exodus chapter 20, and we're going to be looking at verses 1 through 6. And it says, "And God spoke all these words, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourselves an idol to form anything in heaven, above, or on earth beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the fathers to the 3rd and 4th generation, to those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments." So, the first commandment is the basis for all of the rest of the commandments. It's probably all the 10 commandments I'd say is the most important one. I can tell you quite clearly if you do not obey the first one, you won't obey the second or the third, or all the way down to the 10th. That first commandment is the foundation of us understanding how to obey all of those. And of course, God lays down very quickly. He says, you'll have no other gods before me. And it's spoken in a language you might say to a sovereign, the Lord himself, to we who are his servants, his creation. So he speaks with authority. He tells us basically how it's going to be. He tells us this: we can have no dual relationships, no dual allegiance when it comes to serving God. We find that reinforced in the book of Matthew chapter 5, verses 8 through 10, when Jesus in the temptation there in the desert, and he's tempted by the devil, to bow down to him. This is Matthew chapter 4, verses 8 through 10, and we find this. So again the devil took him up to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. All this I will give you, he said, if you will bow down and worship me. Jesus said to him, away from me, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only. So we find that reaffirmed by Christ himself in the New Testament. And so that's a reaffirmation of that. God goes on to talk about the fact that he's not merely asserting that he is he's superior to other gods. He asserts that there are no other gods. He's more than superior. He simply says there are no other gods. He declares that they do not exist, for example. And so that first one is there is more than a prohibition. It's I guess you'd say a gut check reality. We look at what the writer says here. Because in reality, the fact that there are no other gods. He is the one and only living God, because there are no other gods. Now, it might seem obvious to you, in one sense, that the people's great enemy, the people here, God had just riled the people's enemy and the Egyptians. It seemed obvious that maybe they were going to serve him and understand his great power and not get involved in worshiping other things. But you have to understand the background of the Egyptians as slaves themselves. They spent 430 years in Egypt. You had several generations go by, 6, 7 generations. And in that 6 or 7 generations, they had been constantly saturated with what we call polytheism of Egypt. Egypt had a multitude of gods, almost for anything you can think about, as many other nations that particular day and time. So they had a long period of time for their children to grow up, and their children to grow up, and so on, to abandon God. Now, the danger here was not for the Israelites to, in a sense, abandon God entirely. The danger was this: they would add the other gods to the God of Abraham, and God here prohibits that. He prohibits the Israelite people from adding other gods, along with their worship of Him. He says, "I'm the one and only God. Worship me only." And so He expressed that very clearly to them, and that's one of the reasons He had to do that. If you follow the history of the Jewish nation down to the rest of the Old Testament, you'll find that Israel struggled time and time again with just making the worship of one true God, what they call Yahweh. They often added other gods, the Molochs and the Baals and the Ashtoreths, all of them you find there in the Old Testament. So the danger here was not that they would abandon God. The danger was they'd add more gods to that. And let me quickly say to you, that's a clear danger of us today. Now, it's quite true we're not going to worship in the sense of what we call other gods like the Baals and the Molochs and the Ashtoreths and the gods of Egypt. What we're in danger of doing is we add other gods in the sense of whatever makes most important thing in our life, the thing that drives our life. For example, it might be money, it might be power, it might be relationships, it might be our job, and we add that to our worship in the sense of God. And so in that sense, God says there are to be no other gods. So that's how we can look at it in our early day and time. Temptation was always there for them. They often succumbed to that. Now, they were called to monotheism, which is simply the worship of one true God, away from polytheism. Now, that's not a new thing for the Jews to look at. We find all the way back in the book of Genesis, when we find Adam and Eve, we find there in that particular context, it's implicitly implied that it worship the one true God, the God of Adam and Eve there in the Garden of Eden. But we find out quickly, that as the generations go by, they quickly begin to forget to do that, and they begin adding other gods to it. Matter of fact, we find in Genesis chapter 35, verse 2 and 3, we find the story of Jacob. Jacob is who becomes Israel, becomes the father of the 12 patriarchs of the Israelite nation. So this is an important figure. But it says this: so Jacob said to his household, all who were with him, get rid of the foreign gods you have with you, and purify yourselves, and change your clothes, and become, let us go to Bethel, where I will build an altar to God, who answered me in the day of my distress, who has been with me wherever I've gone. Now first, let's talk about the word Bethel. That's an extremely important word. Bethel is an English translation of two Jewish words, and the words are Beth and El. Beth translates to house, and El translates to God. So what's Jacob saying? Let's go to the house of God, and when we go, let's abandon these other gods we have with us. Let's lay them aside. And if you read the rest of the story, you'll find out that they go to their saddles, and they throw aside all these called household gods. So there's a real illustration there for you and I. As we come to worship God, as we come to the house of God, as we come to our Bethel, we have to understand to lay aside those false gods long before we get here. Perhaps when we are here, we become convicted of the concept that we are worshiping, maybe it's power and money, or influence, our home, our job, whatever it might be. God says, lay those aside when you come to worship me. So it's an extremely important word, by the reason I define the word Bethel for you. And so we find there among Jacob's family these idols, and he obviously needs to get rid of them. So I remind you again, the danger was that the Israelites would not just simply abandon God. The danger was they'd add more gods to go with the God of the Yahweh they call God, and worship the other gods along with Yahweh. That's still a similar danger we have today, as I spoke about already. And so we have to understand that. We have to be real careful not to add these other gods to be the gods of our life. We look at it like that. Now, there was a time when there was mankind's past when only the one true God was worshipped. We find that in the Garden of Eden, for example, Adam and Eve. And that's the one true time that it actually did occur. And so there's a single-mindedness about worshiping the one true God. But where we find this one true, in this particular context of Adam and Eve, we find the loss of the worship of the one true God. Remember, Satan comes, tempts Adam and Eve not to eat the particular forbidden fruit, and they do indeed do that. Now, here's how they lose the singular worship of God. At that particular point, as happens throughout mankind's history, Adam and Eve placed themselves in position saying, maybe not clearly as you read the scripture, that's what they're doing, that they're the God. They make the decision about what they worship, how they do it, and who they obey, and whether they'll obey God or not. So they rose up to a point at that particular place, they began to place themselves in the place of God. That's what we do when we add other gods often. We put ourselves in the place of God. Only God has the right to decide and tell us how he'll be worshipped, and not us. And so God makes that clear there to us, of singleness. So the one true worship there vanishes in the Garden of Eden, and it won't be restored again until the end time. We're looking at the book of Revelations, when the New Jerusalem descends, and we are all part of the citizens of New Jerusalem. We'll find there that it'll restore the one true worship of God. In between all that process, though, the one true God, worship of one true God is not going on in our world today. And sadly, not even among many Christians. They don't even recognize the fact that they place something between themselves and God, something that they think is more important than God himself. And so we look at that process there. One day it will be restored. And so we're going to quickly look at the second commandment. He says now he talks about not making any image to represent him. And there's quite a bit of danger to idolatry. And we're going to go through that real rapidly and quickly this morning, look at the process. And so he says there in that second verse, or fourth verse, you shall not make yourself an idol in the form of anything in heaven above or in the earth beneath or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I am the Lord your God. I am a jealous God, punishing the children of the sin of the fathers, the third and fourth generation. Those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. So he goes into some detail about the power and danger of idol worship. And one of the problems with idol worship, as we're going to find out later on, when we find the issue of the golden calf occurring in Exodus about chapter 35, is they replace they're trying to make some image of God that they can visually see. And that image is it's basically a lie. God's not like that. God's greater than the image, and God recognizes that we have a weakness in our I guess you'd call our DNA, to turn to the image rather than turn to God himself. The danger he talks about there is going to result in us making God look smaller than he is, seem smaller than he is, less powerful than he is, less great than he is. Because now we're looking at, for example, in Exodus, the golden calf. I'll get that a little bit later on about how that reduces what he looks like. He goes on very specifically what we're not to do about when it comes to idol worship. Now, here in the book, it says, do not bow down, do not make, do not bow down, do not serve. He goes on to talk about how it's the consequences are quite grave. He talks about here, we look at this particular passage. He says, I'm a jealous God. I will punish the children of the sin of the fathers to the third and fourth generation to those who hate me, to show love to 1,000 generations to those who love me and keep my commandments. Your first thought might be, well, that seems like it's not fair. God would punish these generations, the children of generations, it says, the third and fourth generation. Understand something. What do these children have these children become? Their fathers, their mothers have become what? Idol worshipers. They've abandoned the one true worship of God. And what have they taught their children? To do the very same thing. God says the curse that goes with that passes from generation to generation to generation. Passes downward. And those children teach their children. That's what he's talking about. So by the time it passes down. Billy Graham once said that Christianity is just one generation away from disappearing. If this generation doesn't pass on to the next, then it just disappears. Well, the context of what I just said was that occurs also if you have a wrong view of how to worship God, and here in this particular context, they're making idols about that. Now, notice it goes on to say that shall love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. So God says one way to show that you love me is what? Obey me. The best way to say that we really are worshiping the one true God is that we obey. Obedience is the foundation of our righteous living and our right life. Again, I'm not talking about salvation, I'm talking about how we live once we know Christ, our personal Savior. So God says when we teach our children that he's the one true God and to worship him in that manner and fashion, it'll go down from generation to generation. It proves these people love me, and they're teaching their children to love me, and from generation to generation, they'll continue the blessing on their life rather than the curse. That's why he spells that out here in this particular context we're looking at here. It does talk about two contexts here. And I just want to reaffirm again the very great truth I said a while ago. God is the one who determines how we worship him and determines what's acceptable worship. We don't determine that. He tells us quite clearly we're not determining that he's the one who's to do that. And so he tells us this here in this context, and we look at it. So it's not allowed. He says, don't make an idol. And there's a reason for that. When we make an idol, we are saying, I have set up how I will worship God. I made my decision, made my choice. I decide I'll do it this way, not God's way. There again, we place ourselves in a position of being where God should be. We made ourselves God to say, we'll do it my way. And that's one of the dangers, again, about that. Of course, it seems to us today, as I said already, it's kind of obvious to us today, we're not going to carve out anything. We're not going to make a stone image. We're not going to do anything that the Jews talked about. It should be very easy to avoid, right, in our modern generation. But again, I remind you, idols are not always stone and always wood. They're always images that we can see. For example, in our modern society, there are some things that we don't see necessarily in the sense of an idol. But material possessions can become that. Getting farther and farther, getting more and more money, sinking more and more of our time in advancing that money, getting more and more wealth, making our career success so successful that God has been pushed off to the side. He's no longer the heart and center of what's driving our lives. Popularity, to be popular today in our society, and that's one of the things that our teenage kids go through. But to push aside the loyalty to God, for example, as a teenager might, to fall in with the wrong crowd, to do the wrong thing as a teenager, and those kind of issues. So that then becomes their idol. And so we place all those things in a place of where God ultimately goes. Anything we place in God's place, that we look for ultimate success, we look for ultimate enjoyment in life, look for ultimate purpose and fulfillment while we're living our lives, those things are idols at that particular point. And God forbids us to do that. And so we need to keep that awareness. Now, the question comes to mind quite quickly, why no images? I pointed out already, we're going to look at this a little bit more. Well, let's look at it this way. God is infinite and invisible, right? Can't be seen everywhere at one time, or it's an idol. Can be seen, it's in one place, for example. So it makes God look smaller than he is and less powerful than he is. And so maybe it's made of paint or plaster or the things I just talked about. None of those things really give a true relationship or a true version of what God is like. And so what we end up doing is we end up worshiping a lie. When the Israelites worshiped the golden calf, they were worshiping a lie. The calf was not God in that sense of it. And so I'm going to quote from here. The writer looks down. He talks here, says, interested, Adam seems to conceive the golden calf as an image of Yahweh, not as a lesser or different deity. This evidence the way that he describes and executes the feast day. Israel feasts and sacrifices before image purpose to be of the one true God. But the calf can't be that. The image lies about God only. It truly is. Think about the enormity of the lie. Here's what the writer quotes. The golden calf, it is small, but God is immense. It's innate, but God is spirit. The golden calf is location bound, but God is everywhere fully present. The golden calf is created, but God is uncreated. The golden calf is new, but God is eternal. The golden calf is impotent, but God is omnipotent. The golden calf is destructible, but God is indestructible. The golden calf is of minor value, but God is of infinite value. And the golden calf is blind and deaf and mute, but God sees, hears, and speaks. And that's the point of the whole image of it being a lie in that sense of it. So this image that they built of the golden calf, or image that we might build in the sense of a golden calf or an idol in our lives, is simply a lie. It cannot represent God because God is far more immense than that. And so we need to talk about the true worship we looked at, restoring that. A golden calf is a false teacher. It reveals only that God is made less than the real God is. That's what it would tell us. It's a false truth about God. God is much greater than these images we might create in our hearts and our minds, much greater than the image of the golden calf here we find in the book of Exodus. And so let me go in a quote for the writer. It said, God has chosen to reveal himself through the scriptures and through Christ. We know the truth about who God is by becoming acquainted with his revelation, by learning the Bible, by measuring all teaching by against his word. The revelation, obviously, is Jesus Christ, the Bible itself, and then teaching that word and living that word. As we know the truth about who God is through Christ, a spiritually undiminished image bearer, we get a true image of the real God. And then, quote again, God alone is permitted to make a graven image of himself. He has done so. Now, when did he do it? In you and I as humanity. That's what it tells us. We're the image of him. We must not make images of God because we ourselves bear the image of God. Because of sin, we do so in a diminished way. No one has an image of God perfectly except one. And this is Colossians chapter 1, verse 15 as I close out. He, as Jesus, is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. So there's our first lesson. Next week we'll look at the third and fourth commandments. You have a God-blessed day, and we'll see you next week.